You all right? Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name's Chris Coleman from Fugro. I'll be chairing tonight's talk, the title of which is Engineering Geology and Risk, Offshore Glacial Deposits Around the UK. We have two excellent speakers tonight, both from Fugro, colleagues of mine. The first, Dave Harrison, will be talking us through using a ground model to appraise geotechnical risk. It's focused on offshore glacial deposits, predominantly in the North Sea. Our second talk this evening will be by Leah Arlott, and that'll be a case study looking at the Viking Link interconnector project, providing us a cross-section of the last glacial maximum in the southern North Sea. We are live streaming tonight. How I would like to run the evening is that Dave will go first. After Dave's talk, we will pause for a couple of minutes, and we will take some brief questions from the audience. As we are live streaming, we would ask that anyone asking a question raises their hand. We will then bring a microphone to you. If you could introduce yourself and the organisation that you represent, and then ask your question, and then pass the microphone back once you've asked the question, that would be great. We'll try and limit that to maybe 5 minutes, maybe 3 questions straight after Dave's talk. We'll then move on to Leah's talk. At the end of that, we will have another round of questions, and if anyone has any follow-up questions for Dave, we'll get both of the presenters up here at the lectern, and you can ask away. I will just then close the meeting, thank the presenters, and just go through some of the upcoming events, meetings that we have from the engineering group. Okay, so if I can introduce our first presenter of the evening, Dave Harrison from Fugro.
Okay, good evening. I'm going to talk to you about using an engineering geological ground model to appraise geotechnical risk. Before that, just a little bit about myself. So I graduated from the University of Birmingham in 2007 with a single honours in geology. Soon after that, I got a job with Fugro on their onshore geotechnical division as a geotechnical engineer. A lot of my time was spent on site, working with cable percussion rigs, TPT rigs, which is what you can see in that bottom right image there. After 4 years there, I then moved into the offshore consultancy division of Fugro, still in Wallingford. And here I spend a lot of my time looking at a lot of different data sets and trying to bring them all together in order to sort of identify, understand, quantify and communicate geohazard risk and geotechnical risk to our clients. One part of the geohazard risk assessment is looking at cores, which you can see is what I'm doing in that top right image, where we try and identify geohazard processes and then try and age date them and understand frequency and magnitude. So the presentation tonight, it is using a ground model to understand geotechnical risk. The focus is going to be on glaciogenic sediments in the offshore environment, focusing mainly on the North Sea. And the general sort of engineering theme is going to be more to do with wind farms than anything else. So the content of the presentation is split into 3 main parts. The first few slides look fairly generally at risks posed by glaciogenic sediments. Then we've got a couple of slides on what is a ground model, and then probably the bulk of the presentation, maybe the last half of the presentation, is looking at the actual steps that we go through to build a ground model and how it's used to understand geotechnical risk. So there's lots of risks when developing and planning an offshore development. In sort of low latitude, deep water settings, where we do quite a lot of work at Fugro, a lot of the risks are more geohazard based. So things like turbidity currents in submarine channels, landslides and faults. And then the geotechnical risks for those sort of deep water sites are generally more to do with the very soft hemipelagic sediments that are present, which aren't particularly conducive to good bearing capacities. And also there's a bit of geotechnical variability associated mainly with mass transport deposits, so debris flows and sandy turbidite deposits. However, in high latitude glaciogenic environments, there's not so much in the way of geohazard risk, but the geotechnical conditions are a lot more complex. There's a lot of lateral and vertical variability, and so understanding those is what's crucial for understanding geotechnical risk. Regarding wind farms, as opposed to hydrocarbon developments, cable projects and pipeline projects, which have a degree of flexibility in their plan, they can avoid and route around geotechnical constraints. Wind farms obviously try and stay in a bit more of a sort of systematic grid system, which makes it a little bit more challenging from a sort of site characterization point of view. And also they're very complex from an engineering point of view in terms of the cyclic and lateral loads put on them. So for that reason, a ground model is a very good approach for understanding the conditions at site for a wind farm. An engineering geological ground model is a very useful bridge between two main disciplines. You have your geological discipline and then your geotechnical engineering, and it sort of brings those two together quite well. So here's just quite a nice sort of conceptual figure of a glaciogenic sediment environment, from Reading 1996. I won't go through it in detail, but as you can see, there's quite a lot of different depositional environments, all within a fairly small area. You have your subglacial, superglacial, glacier-marine, and marine, all within a short area. And this is mainly the fundamentals of why we have such variable geotechnical conditions in the North Sea. The Quaternary sediments of the North Sea are split into many different formations, as you know. These are generally based on the seismostratigraphy, borehole data, and age dating. They are very useful for a ground model, particularly in the early stages. They help with correlation and sort of drawing links to other development sites that we might have experience in, but they do provide limited resolution for the purposes of geotechnical engineering. So the variability that we see in the North Sea in geotechnical the sediments that are present, it's down to two main sort of process categories, I guess. So we have our sediment source and depositional processes, and this mainly just determines your sort of intrinsic geotechnical properties, so your compositional variations, your plasticity, and things like that, and it also determines predominantly your vertical variability and your lateral variability. But then on top of those, we have a lot of different post-depositional processes that really heavily affect geotechnical conditions. So you have your ice loading and sediment burial and erosion, and these all different stress histories all result in very variable conditions. In the most extreme case, you have your sort of glaciotectonism processes, where you have a grounded ice sheet shunting and deforming sediments and thrusting older sediments on top of newer sediments. Along the coast of East Anglia, I think there's great big rafts of chalk that have been thrusted into the Quaternary sediments, and from a geotechnical point of view, that kind of situation is very hard to characterise. I think there's been sort of accounts where drilling boats have gone out, drilled through the Quaternary into the chalk, drilled for 10 metres, thinking they're in bedrock, and then gone back into the Quaternary. So from a ground model point of view, very complex, but very important to characterise that sort of environment. So geotechnical conditions and their variability is very important because it influences your site selection, your feasibility of whether the site can be actually put there or not. Foundation selection, so whether you're going to use a monopile, a tripod, or a gravity-based structure, and also the sort of dimensions of those foundations. Project risks generally stem from a lack of understanding the conditions at site and a lack of data. We've just got a few sort of hypothetical examples here. So foundation bearing capacity failure due to installation in an unidentified buried channel. I don't think that picture's real. It looks pretty CGI to me. But yeah, so potentially a channel might have not been identified on the geophysical data. They installed in it, had softer sediments than anticipated, and there was a bearing capacity failure. Suction caisson failure due to installation in unidentified or poorly defined sand layers. For those that don't know, a suction caisson is just a big upside-down metal bucket that sort of penetrates into the ground, partly through its own weight, but also through assistance by suction, where it draws the water out and sucks itself into the ground. Not great if you have some sand layers. It struggles to penetrate those, and the permeability of the sand layers also means the plug inside the suction casing can uplift, and you don't get complete penetration. Foundation buckling due to hitting unidentified cobbles and boulders, and that looks like some kind of 3D finite element analysis that's been done on a pile there. Jack-up punch-through due to poorly characterised interbedded stratigraphy. Obviously, people tend to focus more on the foundations for the actual wind turbines, but it's good to have an awareness of the conditions around the wind turbine for when the temporary structure is in place that installs the actual turbine. In this case, this is 2 of Fugro's big jackups. We have Excalibur and a deep diver installing a wind turbine. And unnecessary and expensive foundation selection due to engineering conservatism. So perhaps if the designer is not completely confident in the conditions that are present, they might overspec the foundation, which can be quite costly. So project risks can also stem not just from the geotechnical conditions, but also not maximising the available data. So one thing we often quite do when we're building a ground model at Fugro is we look at data sets from a different point of view from what they were originally gathered for. So a few examples, we might use environmental photos to understand seafloor sediments, or maybe using microscope descriptions to provide insight into apparently anomalous test results. In fact, just this morning I was looking at some sediments under the microscope trying to see if there was a reason for why we had some anomalously high particle density results. In the end, it had quite a lot of mafic fragments. It was a fairly epiclastic sort of sediment, so that was giving the higher than sort of average particle densities. And we also use things like 3D exploration seismic data, which is acquired to characterize your deep reservoirs, just to provide things like bathymetry surfaces, which is very useful. But it's this sort of multidisciplinary approach that's really important to make sure you maximise all the data sets available and you don't leave anything out. And lastly, most importantly perhaps, you could say managing the data is most important to make sure you don't lose any data or any data isn't maximised or not used. So what is a ground model? A ground model effectively reviews and integrates available data with the aim of predicting ground conditions across a site. For deep water geohazardous sites, the ground model also pays quite a lot of attention to characterising the geohazards that are present at site. But in the North Sea, there's not too many of those, and so it focuses more on just predicting geotechnical conditions. This provides useful input into layout planning and foundation design. It's very useful for identifying engineering challenges, which therefore reduces your engineering risk. It makes the most out of site investigation data, and it's very useful for optimising future site investigations by highlighting data gaps and areas of uncertainty. And there's sort of an example there of a soil province map, which is one of the outputs from a ground model. That's a central image you see there. So we have soil provinces mapped laterally across the site, and then we have associated soil profiles on the bottom image that give you a sort of indicative stratigraphy for each of those provinces. And then the top image is just a sort of conceptual block diagram to sort of communicate some of the geohazards in this case. Sorry. So there's a lot of different datas that go into a ground model. This is just listing the main ones, I guess. At an early stage sort of part of the ground model, we normally just look at public domain data, Fugro experience in similar settings, and any data that might be available for a site. Generally, for an early stage test study, we just focus on, there's never any site-specific data really early on. So we just look at the Fugro experience and publicly available data. But as site investigations are performed and data become available, they feed into the ground model. It's refined and updated and reissued. So when developing a ground model, particularly for the North Sea and glaciogenic sediments, there's a few sort of key considerations. The first one is defining the extents, thicknesses, and the representative geotechnical properties of the different sediments that are present across the site. Again, particularly for the North Sea and Quaternary sediments, you need to pay extra attention to identifying the extents, depths, and thicknesses of any channel infill sediments. Highlight any geotechnically uncharacterized seismic units, so seismic packages that are characterized but not necessarily penetrated or tested by geotechnical data, and highlight any poorly characterized or potentially variable soil units, and highlight potential for cobbles and boulders where appropriate. Often cobbles and boulders aren't sampled, but based on their depositional history, you can assume they're going to be present in some cases. So developing a ground model, these are the sort of 6 main steps that we go through in Fugro. Different people have different approaches to building a ground model. This is the way we do it. There's other ways of doing it as well. And on the right, there's a bit of a flow diagram of the different stages, which I think I've tried to sort of keep on all of the subsequent slides to give you an idea of where we are in the process. As you can see, there's a few steps where potentially they can result in refinement of the previous steps. So it can be a bit of an iterative process where you go around in circles a few times before you continue. but I'll just go through these one at a time. So the first step is looking at the literature review and understanding the geological model. Really useful to understand the evolution of the site from a geological point of view and to understand the different depositional environments that have been present over the site. We generally rely heavily on the BGS regional guides and the maps and the regional or the BGS borehole viewer that's available online. We use a lot of the sort of Fugro experience in the region, particularly in the North Sea. We've got a lot of data, so we rely heavily on that. And the aim really is to just try and understand what formations might be present, what sediments might be present, and understand the sea level variations. For deep water geohazardous sites, the evolutionary model is really important, largely because these fluctuations in sea level are generally tied quite closely to the different geohazards, especially on the sort of continental slopes. When you have a sea level low stand, the shore extends shoreward or seaward, and your river sediments deposited on the continental slope. This causes things like turbidity currents and landslides. During sea level high stands, those sort of geohazards are generally less active. So it's very useful for understanding geohazards. Next step is to look at the geotechnical data and try and unitize it. We generally unitize based on unique geotechnical properties. You can sub-unitize if appropriate to sort of communicate the smaller changes in conditions. And this allows for assessing the quality and applicability of the data, identifying any sort of anomalies and areas of interest. It gives you a sort of degree of confidence in the extrapolation of data. You know, if you've got the same conditions or same soil units at different boreholes, you can assume somewhere in between probably extend. And it helps tie all the sediments back to the geological model. The approach we normally take for geotechnical unitization is to go through borehole logs one by one and actually assign different units and then perhaps put them on some kind of cross-section and draw some sort of approximate correlations. And also look at the geotechnical data, so things like shear strength. In this case, we've got water content on the left and unit weight on the right. Generally, if you've got a robust unitization in place, if you then plot the geotechnical data on top of one another for the same unit, they should align and group fairly well. In this case, it works quite nicely. There's not too much scatter. And if possible, try and link some kind of BGS formation and some kind of depositional environment to the different units that you've got. And then, once you've done your geotechnical unitization, you can move on to your geophysical unitization. So this is looking at the seismic data and trying to assign seismic stratigraphic units. These are based on the sort of acoustic signature and the bounding characteristics of the seismic data. This is quite a nice example from the North Sea where we've got what's interpreted as the Boulders Bank and Egmont Ground and the Swartz Bank. And then we've got the Yarmouth Roads and potentially some older tertiary sediments underneath all that. And in the bottom image, it's quite useful to try and put it in 3D and understand how they all relate across the site. So we just got some 3D modelling that we did in Arcscene. So once you've got your unitization in place, the next step is to look at integrating the data. So this is bringing it together, trying to figure out if every geotechnical change is represented by a geophysical horizon, and trying to figure out whether every geophysical horizon is represented by a geotechnical change. It's quite rare that they always do correlate. As you can see in this example, we've got 3 boreholes with CPT profiles as the wiggle tracers down the right-hand side. And then we sort of superimposed the geophysical interpretation. The geophysical data itself has been removed to keep it a bit clearer, but you can see the horizons marked as dashed lines. So you can see there's not always perfect correlation. There's a few horizons there. I'll just use a pointer. This central one here doesn't really seem to correlate particularly well with any sort of geotechnical change. But then perhaps this one does seem to work quite well. Quite often, as I said, this is sort of an iterative process. You might need to go back, in this case, to the geophysical data and see if you can maybe tweak the assumed seismic velocities to try and bring the horizons up or down a little bit to make them line up with the geotechnical boundaries a bit more. Or you might need to go back to the geotechnical data, maybe subdivide some of the units to try and pick up on some of these boundaries that the geophysical data is picking up on. A few more examples of data integration here. So, as I've said, it's very important to try and visualize the different data and the correlations. We like using Arcscene, which is part of the ArcGIS package. It allows for figures like that top right image you can see there. So in this case, we've got a seismic horizon in 3D, and then we've superimposed some different unitized boreholes with the different colors representing the different units. As you can see, there's an orange unit where the top of the unit seems to maybe perhaps match up with this geophysical horizon. Not in all cases. It looks like some work might need doing on either the geotechnical unitization, or perhaps the geophysical picking might just need tweaking, or a different velocity might need using to convert it into time, or to convert it to depth, sorry. And in the bottom image, we've just got an example. This is a screenshot from GIS, and the background image is sort of a hillshade, bathymetric hillshade, and then we've overlain a raster of a geophysical horizon in red to green. And what you can do in GIS that's quite useful, you can use tools just to extract the different values for different rasters into point files for things like the boreholes. So we've got several boreholes present in red dots. So you can extract the depth to geophysical horizon into the attribute table with that point file, and then use that to help draw correlations. So once you've calibrated your geophysical horizons, so you've confirmed whether or not they relate to a geotechnical change, you can consider those horizons as being representative of a soil unit boundary. And we got three sort of examples here from the North Sea, just of two channelized or channel infill deposits in the top and bottom, and then more of a sheet-like laterally extensive unit in the middle that's been incised and eroded by some of the channel units. And it's important at this point to communicate any areas or any geophysical units that haven't been characterized geotechnically. Once you've got all your seismic horizons, your soil unit boundaries in GIS, you can then use them to try and understand the variations in stratigraphy and what different stratigraphic layering you have. Just some conceptual cross sections here, but in this case we've tried to sort of assign a different summary profile to every single stratigraphy. So we've got 6 geological formations. We have the Holocene sediments, Botany Cut, Boulders Bank, Egmont Ground, Swarter Bank and Yarmouth Roads. In this case we can assume they've just got one soil unit assigned per formation. In reality there might be several geotechnical units in each formation, but to keep it simple we just assume one unit. And it gets quite complex, you can see. So, for example, in profile 1A, we have Holocene sediments over the Boulders Bank formation, over the Yarmouth Roads, whereas in 2B, we've got Holocene sediments over Botany Cut, over Boulders Bank, over Yarmouth Roads. And some of the more complex ones, like 4G, we've got Holocene sands over Botany Cut, over Boulders Bank, over Egmont Ground, over Swarter Bank, and then if you go a bit further down, below the depth of interest, you might then go into the Yarmouth Roads. So it gets very complicated. But it's a useful exercise to define all your different stratigraphies. If you then map them out in GIS, you might have something that looks like that, which is a pretty complex soil province map. We have 20 different soil provinces. It's then at that point, you might need to decide whether that level of detail is appropriate. Is it too detailed in a way that it's hard to communicate the variations across site, or is it not detailed enough? In this case, we considered it a little bit too detailed, and so we decided that the Egmont Ground, Swarter Bank and Yarmouth Road soil units were not too geotechnically dissimilar from one another, and so we grouped them together, and instead we focused more on trying to characterize the lateral variations in the Botany Cut formation, and so we ended up with just 3 soil profiles, with profile 1 being on the sort of inter-channel areas, 3 being sort of in the channel areas where the Botany Cuts present over the full range, depth range of interest for the foundations, and then soil profile 2 was somewhere in the middle. Once we have the soil province map in place, we can then go back to the geotechnical data and the unitization and try and derive some representative parameter profiles which are used for the engineering assessments, such as pile drivability and bearing capacity. Typical parameter profiles are things like undrained shear strength, unit weight, friction angle, relative density, epsilon 50, moisture content, plasticity. And if you've got a robust unitization in place and you've got a fairly hefty geotechnical data set, this is quite easy. You have a lot of data, you can plot it up, and then you can draw your bounds and your best estimate. Typically, we define 3 bounds. We have a best estimate, a low estimate, and a high estimate. The low estimate and high estimate try to bound the sort of credible range that you might expect in that unit, and then the best estimate is sort of mean value. Quite often we use the DNV standard of practice, which is to define the best estimate as the mean of the data set, and then the low bound, or the low estimate and high estimates, are 2 standard deviations either side of the mean. So this statistical approach, it's good and it's repeatable and it works well for large data sets that are normally distributed, but data sets are rarely normally distributed. Normally you don't have that perfect bell-shaped curve that's nice and symmetrical. You normally have something that's a bit more like that histogram that you can see there. So your mean is actually a little bit to the right perhaps of where you might want it to be, and your high estimate doesn't quite capture some of these high values. There are credible results. They do exist. They're not anomalies. So it's at this point we might need to employ a degree of what we call engineering geological judgment, where we actually define the bounds manually with a lot of QC. So we define a best estimate, a high estimate, and low estimate based on the trends that we see in the full data sets. This is probably one of the better ways, especially for data sets such as that undrained shear strength, where we have a lot of different test types, each with different reliabilities. And one important part or sort of process to go through is there are outliers in the data sets, and these need to be acknowledged. But before you remove them from the data set, it's a good practice to try and justify their removal. So you need to have a look at their test reliability. So are they a fairly rubbishy pocket penetrometer test, or are they a very reliable consolidated anisotropically undrained triaxial test? Can any of the test results be sort of explained by soil fabric? So did they fail along a fissure which gave it an anomalously low undrained shear strength? Were the samples disturbed perhaps? Is it actually from a different soil unit, that test result? Maybe it needs reallocating into a different plot. And have you corrected the CPC using an NKT factor that's applicable to get your undrained shear strength profile? So I've shown a few examples of GIS and how it's used. For those that aren't so familiar, I'll just run through it quite quickly. So GIS is a very useful data management sort of software. You can put in most kinds of geographical data that I can think of. The main omission at the moment is geophysical data. You still have to look at that in a geophysical software package such as IHS Kingdom. But what you can do is you can pick horizons and export it and load it into GIS. So you can effectively have your seismic data in GIS. But all the data points are loaded as either rasters, point files, line files, polygons, and they all have geographical coordinates. The interface looks a little bit like that. So you have a table of contents down the left-hand side where you can turn on and off your different data sets, and you can view all your different layers. You can also interrogate the data quite well. Fugro have built a couple of sort of customized tools where you can select a number of borehole locations, for example, and you can view all of their geotechnical data all at once. And the geotechnical data is held within the attribute table of the borehole. And again, there's just an example of 3 CPTs that have been plotted all on top of each other. Very good just for looking at the data and how it correlates across site. Very useful when building a ground model. And not so useful for a ground model, but quite a cool example. You can also put some pictures in there. So in this case, we had a pipeline survey done by an ROV where it had gone along and taken photos every 50 meters. And we just loaded them into GIS. And you can use a hyperlink tool, click on the pipeline, and it loads the photos. But as I said earlier, you can use these sort of photos to understand perhaps your seafloor sediments, which can then feed into your ground model. So I think I've gone through that quite fast, actually. So in summary, an engineering geological ground model is a very useful and robust approach to maximize all the available data. The process that I went through is just one method of putting one together. There are other methods, I'm sure. A ground model approach is an essential tool for linking the geology to the geotechnical engineering, and it's particularly helpful for highlighting areas for further engineering consideration and for further data acquisition. So variable and naturally discontinuous channel infill, for example, geotechnically uncharacterized seismic units, poorly characterized geotechnical units, really variable soil units, and the potential presence of cobbles and boulders. But it should be considered a live being that needs updating and refining as new data become available. Done. Any questions?
Thank you, Dave. Do we have any questions? Okay.
Okay, I have one. Dave, you've skillfully taken us through how you develop your ground model. One of the things that I'd like you to elaborate a bit more on is how specialist knowledge, particularly with these dealing with glacial deposits and in the North Sea, where we see such complexity, such variation across the North Sea. The results from the Dogger Bank investigations, where we're seeing extensive glacier tectonisation. How do you see the need for experts in glacial deposits to become part of the team when you're developing these ground models?
Cheers, guys. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, as you said, there's so many complex variables when you're looking at glaciogenic sediments. You need that expertise, either in-house or readily available as a consultant. We know a little bit from our time, just a few years working in this sort of environment. We learn quite a lot, but yeah, you need to have the experts readily at hand. Yeah, just an example like glacier tectonism. A lot of people aren't too aware of the extents of the glacier tectonism affected areas. We were able to highlight it on a couple of projects just because we'd seen it on a previous project where we had really nice geophysical data that showed all of the folding and the thrusting. But if you haven't got such nice geophysical data, you might not know it's present. So yeah, that's...
Okay, thank you. I just have one follow-up question, and that relates to Fugro and other companies. We've done a lot of work in the North Sea now for the oil and gas industry and increasingly for the offshore wind. We are starting to characterise the extent of glaciation in that area, and that's really factoring into our understanding and how we're building these ground models. Where do you think we are with this? Is there lots more that we're going to find out as we have more projects, or do you think we're broadly there?
I think Leah can probably answer that better. Your presentation runs through a few of those aspects.
That's excellent.
But yeah, we've got a lot of data. I think we've got a fairly good understanding, but it always changes, doesn't it? I wouldn't be surprised if there are some rather large changes still in the future.
Do we have any final questions before we move on? Okay, with that, if we could, we'll introduce Leah Arlott from Fugro, who'll be taking us through our next presentation.
Right, hi everyone. I just want to say hello to everyone in the room and also to everybody who's listening. I think we've got a reasonable bunch of listeners today. I'm Leah. I've worked for Fugro for nearly 7 years now. I started off as a geophysicist and then moved into a more consultancy-based role. Originally, I did a coastal geography degree at Bangor University, and I've recently completed a master's in engineering geology with the University of Portsmouth. So today I'm just going to run through the Viking Link interconnector project that we've been working on, what that is, what it involved. I'll give you a very, very, very brief overview of the geology of that part of the southern North Sea, run through our data integration methodology and how we ran about categorising the soil, and a bit more of a focus on the Boulders Bank formation. So the Viking Link interconnector project is a high voltage direct current cable route project from the east coast of the UK in Lincolnshire over to Denmark. It's a joint project by Engineering.dk and National Grid in the UK. Fugro completed the survey, that's geophysical and geotechnical survey of the route in summer 2016. And because of the orientation of the route, we get a really nice cross-section of the southern North Sea. The quality of the shallow pinger data we collected was some of the best pinger data I've ever seen, which was really nice and made quite a nice change. But because of the number of samples that we took along the route as well, it gives a really good opportunity to characterise the boundaries of shallow geotechnical units across the region. And I just want to stress now that we're at a really early stage review with the data, and there's the potential for a lot more from these different data sets. So the route is approximately 620 kilometres long. We collected geophysical data, including high-resolution multi-beam data, single-channel seismic data, side-scan sonar and magnetometer data to characterise the seabed sediments and potential obstructions, and also help characterise the geology. With that, we had over 400 twinned CPT and vibrocore locations, so well over 800 locations in total. And we also collected about 30 in situ thermal conductivity tests to have a look at the differing thermal properties of the geological units along the route. The main reason we did this was to help form the engineering basis for the route, but also to characterise the key constraints along the route. As you can all appreciate, the glacial history of the North Sea is pretty complicated and also extremely variable. So we were looking mainly at sediment mobility, particularly in the UK sector and the Danish sector. The presence of any older strata at the seafloor, so in the UK sector in particular, there's chalk either at or just below seafloor in a few different places. The presence of peat as well is quite a big, important one, especially for the thermal conductivity along the route. Glacially affected sediments, in this sense, we're discussing those deposited directly as a result of ice action rather than the periglacial sediments. So subglacial traction tills, glacial tectonites, glacial marine material, and paleochannels. In addition to the glacial paleochannels, we looked at a whole range of different scale of channels for the area. So the Paleo-Elba channel comes out across the southern North Sea, and that's huge and tens of kilometres across, and right the way down to channels which are maybe only a couple of metres across and a couple of metres deep. So obviously with my focus today being on the Boulders Bank Formation, that will be mostly looking at glacially affected sediments. So before the survey, we did a desktop study to look at the different expected ground conditions across the route. This meant that we formulated a prediction of the different expected geologies across the route based on their geological depositional environment. We narrowed that down into 7 main categories, but these can really be narrowed down into three categories, which are highlighted in the colours at the top. So there's the blue, which are mostly glacially derived. Some of these have got a topping of Holocene sands. There's Holocene intertidal and marine sediments, and exposed pre-Vicelian materials. So there's Elsterian tunnel valleys in the outer silver pit that are exposed at seafloor, and also the Cromerian complex sediments as well. I just want to stress that this isn't for hundreds of metres below seafloor, that we were really only looking in the top 10 metres of material. So in order to provide the client with something useful, we integrate the data into a cable geotechnical zonation. This summarises all of the available data that we collected during the surveys and puts it into one big digestible chunk. The cable geotechnical zones are formed based on defined geotechnical soil properties. The soil properties, the boundaries for these are identified in conjunction with the client before we do this, so it's based entirely on their needs and requirements for trenching and installation and the longevity of the cable route. The cable soil categories are then grouped into different zones. As Dave mentioned in his presentation, the simpler you can make it, the more digestible it is, and it takes some of the complication out that might not necessarily be so easy to understand or digest. As you'd expect, the cable geotechnical zones correlate really broadly with the geological summary that we presented earlier on. The zones are then the cable soil categories are then put into profiles which we can then correlate into the zones. So the example I've given on the screen, for example, on the left-hand side, zone 2A, anywhere within that zone that you can expect a profile to have a layer of coarse gravel or coarse sand size material over a layer of clay. And that will be anywhere down within your depth of interest. And likewise, zone 2D, you're only expecting to encounter the clay. So here's just a bit more of a view of the cable soil categories that we came up with. I just want to point out that if I use the terms low strength, high strength, medium strength, the high strength clay is anywhere above 150 kPa for the purposes of soil routing. So it's definitely not some of the strength that's been encountered in some of the glacial sediments. So how did we do it? We came up with the different locations earlier in the project. We gave each borehole as it came in a different cable soil category, and then we put them on a big long piece of paper. We used a big long table, and it took a big long time. And then we went a little bit crazy while we were trying to do this, and grouped them into different cable soil categories to look for. We were trying to look for the patterns that were occurring, so areas of loose sand over particularly dense sand, or loose sand over clay, or loose sand over peat over clay, and things like that. By this point, we were using different coloured skittles to entertain how each of the cable soil categories looked on paper. So we grouped these by obvious categories. The locations that we selected for the cable routing weren't evenly spaced. This is to characterise the route as best as possible. So in areas where the geophysical data was suggesting that it might be quite samey along the route, so as I mentioned earlier, the Paleo-Elba, quite a lot of that is very much the same. So the spacing for the geotechnical locations was much further apart than in areas, say, where the geophysical data was suggesting that there might be more changes, for example, in the UK sector. So this is all of our locations, slimmed down. It didn't fit very well on the screen, so it's a bit squashed. I've just circled a few areas that I mentioned earlier, so the areas where we were looking for mobile sediments or loose material over older or denser material. Areas where older strata was outcropping at seabed, so in the Danish sector, which unfortunately is on the left-hand side of the screen, there was some possibly glacial material, much older glacial material at seafloor. In the UK sector, there's one tiny green stick that you might just be able to make out. That was the one core that we got that sampled chalk. And in the middle of the outer silver pit, the sort of middle pink circle is where the outer silver pit was, and that's where the Yarmouth Roads formation was exposed. The little blue circles represent everywhere we sampled peat, so it's few and far between, but there was quite a lot of it. The glacially affected sediments, the two on the left are the UK sector and Dutch sector glacial material, so the Dogger Bank Formation, the Boulders Bank Formation, and possibly a bit of Cleaver Bank Formation as well. And the stuff on the left is expected to have been periglacially modified. And finally, just the paleochannel sediments, the big ones that showed up very obviously were the Paleo-Elba and the estuary area in the outer silver pit. So you can't see it very well, but we came up with these cable soil categories and cable geotechnical zones for the route. Bear with me, sorry. We came up with 6 primary identifiers for glacially derived sediments, particularly in the UK sector and Dutch sector. Much of the route is characterised by probably 5 of the 6 of those, with the only exception being the presence of peat. We observed that in the furthest offshore reaches and the furthest onshore reaches, we were sampling the lower Boulders Bank Formation unit, which is characterised generally as being a little stronger and quite considerably sandier than the upper unit. But also we've, in recent studies, identified that there are many more layers to the Boulders Bank Formation than originally thought. So most of these, the strength is generally between 75 and 150 kPa, but the 2 inshore and offshore locations, it exceeds that, in some cases up to about 400 kPa. So the Boulders Bank Formation is traditionally described as a subglacial till. It's equivalent to the onshore Skipsea and Withensea till formations. It's a lovely shade of reddish brown. There's a lot of work recently has gone into identifying the boundaries of the ice sheet in the offshore and with that the features within the Boulders Bank Formation, including the work by Bateman et al. Onshore, Clark et al. In 2010, and Dove et al. 2016. These separate units are much better preserved in the inshore, I'd say, nearshore sectors. So anywhere nearshore towards the UK from the Outer Silver Pit, they're much better preserved than they are the other side of the Outer Silver Pit. And these surge moraines have been mapped by Dove, and also some of the recent projects that we've worked on have identified them as well, including this one. So, but further offshore, the boundaries are still very poorly mapped. This is a figure used by Phillips very, very recently to indicate the ice sheet boundaries that have been mapped by different authors over the years. As you can see, there's quite a lot, and they vary in extent and confidence, I think. Just to give you an idea of where the Viking Link interconnector falls across that, you can't see it very well. It's the green line, but it gives you a lovely cross-section along that North Sea ice slope. But offshore, the boundaries are still very poorly mapped, a result of the fact that most of it's been stripped away by erosion. We saw a few interesting things. I've just provided a zoomed-in example of the cable soil categories put onto the cores. This one's the right way around, so the UK's on the left, and Denmark's on, well, the Dutch sector offshore examples are on the right. Inshore, we get some quite obvious buried features where the older units sort of come up, and we're tagging those with the geotechnical data and collecting the stronger clay, and then on top of that we're collecting the weaker upper unit, which is about 100 kPa. Offshore, there's a lot less of it, generally, of the Boulders Bank Formation. There are these remnant islands, which might have some indication of the different movements of the ice in the offshore sector, although it's not very well preserved. So the nearshore samples are down in this sector of the Lincolnshire coast. They are mapped across what has been interpreted by Fugro and by Dove et al. As a possible surge boundary. The geotechnical data that we collected across it wasn't very successful, I think largely due to the density of the granular material. The location, B1503, that one, I think there were 6 or 7 entries in the database for that, and none of them went past about half a metre. And all of them were tagging very dense gravels or very coarse granular material. All of these cores are very different in what they contain. Be that very weak clay with silty sand, with some shells in, very dense gravel, and very dense gravelly sand, and very dense fine to medium sand. So that's over the space of a few hundred metres, maybe a kilometre across the whole image, and it's very variable, although geophysically they're in a very similar and indistinguishable unit, although some reflectors are visible. So this is an example of the offshore data that we collected. There are some absolutely stunning channels in the area. It's, like I say, I was really excited when this data was coming in because it was really, really good. The channels have unfortunately meant that a lot of the Boulders Bank Formation has been removed across the area, so I couldn't show you a picture because it didn't show up very well with the long, thin bathymetry image with these little islands in, but they are very distinct and very obvious, and they stand out quite well from the surrounding seafloor. There's no obvious ridges like the buried wedge in the last example, but this is probably because it's either been removed or glacier tectonized by the ice sheet in the offshore sector. But the strength ranges of some of these islands that were sticking around were quite high. Some of the highest examples of data we've got, the shear strength data we've got, were from these islands. There's one that wasn't as good a data example from slightly further towards the UK sector, which was about 500 kPa. And compared to some of the other very low values we were getting for the Boulders Bank Formation, that was very interesting. It's likely that if there were any evidence of these moraines, that they'll have been removed in these locations purely because of the amount of erosion that's happened across the area. Further offshore, there is quite a defined strength change across about a kilometre's worth of distance. And this is almost as far offshore as we've recorded the Boulders Bank Formation, but not quite. The last hurrah is probably another 40 kilometres maybe further northwest. I might be exaggerating, maybe 25 further to the northeast, off towards Denmark, but still in the Dutch sector. The strength change here occurs behind, so south and west of where the furthest extent of the ice sheet is predicted to have been at its maximum extent. The shear strength change, it doesn't show very well in this picture, but basically the examples on the left are around 200 kPa and the ones on the right are around 100 kPa. So we're not quite sure what was happening on either side of the divide to make the stress history different across such a relatively short area. Is it a result of thinner ice or multiple stages of loading? So if a surge has come across to around that point and the Boulders Bank Formation behind it's had extra loading, or is it that the margin at this point was beginning to float? I don't know, so answers on a postcard, very welcome. So I just wanted to plot up the features that I've briefly talked about today. So the inshore, our inshore example doesn't map with anything apart from the ridges that Dove has identified, but that might just be that Dove's not identified the furthest extent which this map shows. The high strength, the strength change, and our last hurrah core, all three of them map very closely to the ice extents that have been previously put forward by different authors. And I wasn't sure whether this was because everybody's picked up on different features and they're all right, but they're all wrong at the same time. Again, happy to have someone explain, because the more anyone can teach me, the better. I'm more than happy to learn. But I just found it really interesting that our identified features mapped so closely with so many of the different authors. Our last hurrah core, I'm going to keep calling it that, matches most effectively with the Brit ice margin that's been mapped. But because of the rate of the amount of eroded material in that area, it's very difficult to say if it went any further or not. There are some cores that we're looking into at the minute that are identified further north and east again, that match up with the Sejrup in his 2016 paper. But I need to look at that in more detail. But they look very deformed, and it looks like it could have been a byproduct of very proximal ice, if nothing else. So just to start summing up, really, this map presents a margin drawn by Bateman et al. In 2015 for the onshore glacial limits around 19 to 18,000 years BP. It also uses the surge moraines mapped by Dove et al. And also in Cameron 1992, the regional BGS report for the southern North Sea. I've popped on some of our findings, understandings for the offshore and inshore sectors based on our considered possible glacial limits based on strength changes across the area, the strength changes that we've identified in geotechnical cores, and the interpreted moraines that we've seen. And then just to round it off, because I love evolutionary models, here's a snapshot of what the southern North Sea might have looked like. It's extremely oversimplified, and that uses, again, Bateman's margins, Humark Nielsen for the Danish sector and Paleo-Elbe area, And the big bit in the middle that the Dogger Bank Formation is I'm just going to say here be dragons, because it's still under a lot of review by the Dogger Bank team, and they're doing a lot of work on all the data that's been collected over there, and I'm really looking forward to what comes out of it. Hopefully one day we can have a nice big picture of the whole of the southern North Sea, instead of just focusing on the UK, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands. So I think, to summarise, really, what I'm trying to highlight is the variation that we see in the Boulders Bank Formation is really important to try and get a grip on, because by understanding the different subunits of the Boulders Bank Formation, that goes for timing, loading, depositional history, the estimates that we can put forward for engineering parameters, as Dave mentioned earlier, can be a lot less conservative, and therefore hopefully save somebody a lot of money. Because if you know exactly where, for example, the weaker upper layer is going to fall in relation to the stronger lower layers, or if there are any ridges that only occur in very specific areas, you know exactly, if you can map out roughly where you're going to approach those, you can say, well, we only need to use this bit of ploughing equipment, which is very expensive, on this tiny bit of the route, rather than have it for a wider stretch just because it says it's the Boulders Bank Formation and therefore it must be the same. The data that we've acquired for this project is a really, really good regional snapshot. It's only shallow. The Pinger data, I think, in its best penetration reaches about 50, 60 metres below seafloor. But it would be really interesting if we could integrate that with either wider regional data sets or more localised, narrow, deeper data sets to see what's going on and try and continue building on the picture of the southern North Sea. I just wanted to say a big thank you to National Grid and Energinet for letting us use the data and show you wonderful people what we've been working on. And if anybody's interested in following the project or reading a little bit more about it, there's the Viking Link website is quite user-friendly. Thanks. Any questions? Just to finish, these are some cakes we made. They basically represent all of the different cable geotechnical zones that we encountered along the route, and I'm optimistic that they probably tasted a little bit better than the actual samples. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Leah. Do we have any questions? I'm going to, if you can just, I'll come to you one at a time because we've got a few here. If you could just state your name and if you're representing an organisation, if you could state that as well.
Ray Hobbs, consultant. This is not really a geotechnical question, but I noticed you've got a magnetometer listed. Did you have any problems? Did you find any UXOs?
We weren't using UXO setup for this particular project. I think we were just towing a single magnetometer to more accurately define the REX cable routes and large ordnance. We do have quite a good setup for UXO that we've used recently on some wind farm jobs, which uses a different, it's a fixed frame magnetometer, and that's been very useful, and we found some pretty nasty stuff. But no, we didn't use it for this job.
And did you actually go through an area that might have potentially had UXOs dumped?
I think the route itself has been developed to avoid the specific disposal areas, but there's always, anywhere, either side, there's always the chance we're going to find it.
John Arthur, Top Hole Site Studies. Well, very ambitious project. How wide was your corridor there, and what frequency pinger were you using?
Off the top of my head, the corridor was a couple of 100 metres wide, but we were only, for the initial stuff, we were only using the single line, the centre line, for the seismic, for the locations, the cores, when we were trying to define those. The frequency of the pinger, off the top of my head, I can't know, but I could probably find out.
I'm just wondering whether you were being a bit ambitious to engage in a project like this with only a pinger. You've said you've got some good data, and you've mentioned at the end of your talk 50 to 60 metres penetration, which is quite remarkable,
It was
whatever frequency the pinger is. But was there not some consideration when you set out to actually use a source which has got a bigger frequency band and a little bit more power? If you're looking at glacial elements, then there are some areas where you're not going to get any penetration at all.
No, that's very true. For this particular element of the survey, it was really not, it was the next one up from a recon survey. We knew where the route was going to go, but because it's only a cable route project, they're only interested in the top 10 metres anyway. So they were more than happy with the data that we were able to provide with the acquisition software that we proposed. So.
Hi, Dave Giles from Portsmouth. I'm interested in your large channels. What was the orientation of the channels with respect to the ice front? And did you consider, or was there any evidence they may be fluvial in terms of the sort of the transverse valleys you get across the kind of North German plain and into Denmark, extending across into the North Sea?
I think the number of different internal reflectors that we were seeing within them were quite suggestive that the channels have migrated quite substantially over a relatively big distance. Some of those channels in the centre of the route were, again, tens of kilometres across and long, and they were in every direction you can imagine. I think originally there's a good chance that they probably started off as the subglacial channels and then rapidly just became the outwash channels and then subaerially exposed river channels later on. I think, yeah, pick a direction. They were going everywhere, Dave.
Jason Manning, Arup. Thank you both. Very, very good presentations. Question to you both, really. The rafting of bedrock, but also of soil such as peat. Were you able to identify any of these? And also, were you able to characterise which sections of the route may be more susceptible to these occurring?
On this particular project, we didn't identify any rafted material. There's a project we worked on a couple of years ago, which we strongly suspect we did identify it in the seismic data. We didn't get that from the Pinger data. That was using a boomer system instead. Unfortunately, the guys on the geotechnical acquisition vessel for that particular job saw that there was a potential obstruction and didn't sample it, which was entirely unhelpful. It would have been wonderful if they'd actually put it where we asked them to, but they were too worried about their equipment on that occasion. But no, not with this particular job.
I wondered whether the construction method had any impact on your zoning, in the sense that it may be that subtle changes in geology don't make a lot of difference, or may make a lot of difference to the construction method.
Yep. So the cable soil categories that we derived for this particular project, we were in contact with the client at every stage of the way. They gave us the boundaries for the different strengths that they were worried about. So the boundaries for those, the low, or very low, low, medium and high, were set by them as a result of which ploughing methods they wanted to use. And things, the cable soil categories that we came out with were a result of, like I say, the group changes that we identified. So areas where there was loose material over dense material, or in some cases dense material over loose material. Anything that we identified like that was put into its own category, because the client identified fairly early on that density inversions and changes in shear strength over a short distance were something that they were particularly concerned about, and also the presence of peat and paleo channels containing very low strength clay, because of the likelihood of it containing a high quantity of organic matter, which can have quite a negative impact on the thermal resistivity of the cable and surrounding soils. So, I hope that.
Do you know actually what it looks like? You know, like the cable in terms of diameter or depth?
Going on my very limited understanding, it's probably about that big.
Chris Coleman from Fugro. I just have a follow-up question there that relates to the thermal conductivity measurements. Obviously, the peats are the critical deposits for low thermal conductivity, which can lead to overheating of the cable. But how much variation did you see in terms of the thermal conductivity within the glacial deposits, particularly the Boulders Bank till?
Because of the requirements of the project, there was only one in situ thermocon taken in the Boulders Bank formation, so I wouldn't be able to comment on how variable it was in that.
So there's one in situ thermal conductivity measurement. Were there any lab thermal conductivity?
There were some, but I haven't looked at them yet.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not going to lie.
Do we have any final questions? Okay, thank you very much to both of our presenters. Great talks today. Okay, I'll just finish up very quickly again to say thank you to our presenters here. Just to go through a couple of the upcoming meetings that we've got coming up. You'll see on the screen there meetings on the 19th of April, factors affecting mid-latitude quaternary landscape change. That's the now retired Professor Jim Rose, who'll be coming here. Should be a good meeting. Jim is a very good speaker. Evening meeting on the 17th of May, rock slope engineering on the A1 widening scheme. And then we've got the 12th of July accelerated programme for Crossrail's Moorgate Shaft. And then 6th of September, tunnelling ground risk, a perspective. 11th of October, a brief history of construction monitoring in England. Details of all of these can be found on the Engineering Group website. On top of this, we've got a new meeting that's only recently been announced or agreed upon, titled Glacial Deposits, Depositional, Deformational Processes and Engineering Characteristics. So if you've come here today with an interest in glacial deposits, particularly offshore, nearshore and onshore in the UK, then this is the talk for you. This is a whole day event. John Race is kindly offered to convene it, so he'll be doing all the behind the scenes logistics work for it, and I will chair it. This is a great opportunity in the year in risk, and also the fact that the new publication, the special publication of the Geological Society, looking at engineering characteristics of ancient glacial and periglacial terrains, is hopefully coming to publication soon, and so some of the contributors to that publication, including myself, will be providing talks. I myself will cover some of the nearshore glacial deposits that we've encountered around the coast of the North Sea. We have Professor Emery Phillips presenting. He'll be covering some of his findings, his and Claire Mellett's findings on the Dogger Bank and the glacier tectonic sequences and the big moraines that they found there, and actually also covering some initial findings from some collaborative work that Fugro, my own team, have been doing with the BGS up in Cumbria at the moment. We've also got several other people, Simon Davies from Ramboll, and hopefully some speakers from Atkins as well. So really a number of talks highlighting past depositional glacial environments and their associated sediments and structures. We'll be discussing their engineering characteristics and their implications for engineering works. Okay, offshore examples from the North, Baltic and Irish Seas, but like I said, some examples from the nearshore environment and onshore, particularly around the coasts of the UK as well. Once we've finalised this, we'll be publicising it on the Geological Society website, and registration will be opening soon. Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a really good talk. I hope you've all enjoyed it. A few of us will be popping to the local pub just past the Ritz. Dave, I'm very sorry I've forgotten the name again. The Blue Post. So anyone that would like to join us, you're more than welcome for a quick jar before you head off home for the evening. Thank you very much. Yeah.